As one of the most legendary villains in Shonen Jump history, Don Quixote Doflamingo needs no introduction, but I'm gonna give him one anyway. In my experience, even for the biggest critics of One Piece as a story, you're likely to find a grudging respect for the writing and presentation of Doflamingo. Even among the most scathing slander of the story's style post-timeskip, you're likely to find that Doflamingo is a rare highlight even for those who hate it. He's almost universally lauded as a great character and one of the better ones in the story, and he's been discussed to hell and back as an achievement of payoff. In terms of characterization and impact, he is iconic and larger than life, burrowing himself into the minds of watchers and readers. So much so that I had my comments for a completely unrelated Death Note video from ages ago flooded with his name years and years before I even started reading the story, simply because the ideas about justice that I talked about within that video were similar to the things that he gesticulates during Marineford. But the primary draw to his character for me and many others isn't necessarily the insanity and sadism and the undeniable entertainment that he brings, but the incredibly deep, complex, and layered psychology behind why he does all the things that he does. Why does he have this insatiable need to rule over others? Why is he so seemingly needlessly cruel? Why does Luffy specifically rattle him? Why does he have such a bizarre relationship with his crew? Essentially, why did Don Quixote Doflamingo become the man that he is, and what does that say about the world and story of One Piece? This is a question that has invaded my mind since I first met him, and now that I find myself equipped to tackle the intricacies, let's take a look into the fractured mind of Oda's masterpiece of an antagonist, examining his trauma, upbringing, relationships, worldview, and psychological damage, and the imagery and nuances associated with all of that. Along with his brother Rocinante, Doflamingo was born into the Don Quixote family, one of the 20 great royal families that formed the world's government. And I think one of the most important things to establish about him right from the beginning is that due directly to the situation that he was born into and the way that his mind processed it, Doflamingo found himself fundamentally viewing the world differently than virtually anyone else. As a result of their nobility, his family was situated on top of the world, and so, the way that Doflamingo processed this was that the natural state of the world dictated that he was superior to other people, that he was above humans. This was not an intentional or malicious mental process from him. It's simply the way the world functioned from the moment that he was brought into it. He was simply treated as better than everyone else, and as a result, he believed it. To Doflamingo, the natural state of the world was that he was better and superior to everyone else. You or I are born into the world and learn that it's dangerous to run with scissors. Doflamingo is born into the world and learns that he is above and more important than regular people. So if he were to experience a state in which he felt that he was not being treated as above other humans, he would believe that something was very wrong with the world, that the way it naturally functioned was compromised, and this is very key to his character. It is arguably the core of his psychological struggle. It's more than just entitlement. His superiority is something that he sees as a fact of life and an embedded aspect of the world rather than an opinion. And so he needs to be on top, to have power, and most of all, to have control of himself and others, to feel like everything is okay, to avoid feeling like the world is wrong. So that is how we can contextualize Doflamingo's psychology. It's something that was established in him as a child that he continued to permanently carry with him throughout life. This way of viewing the world that, ironically, it can be argued that he had no control over. He lived a naturally privileged childhood as brother to Rocinante and son to Don Quixote Homing and his unnamed mother whom he deeply loved, until Homing decided to stop being a world noble and instead chose to live a comfortable yet normal life in a northern settlement. Having lived as a world noble for all 8 years of his life, Doflamingo found it difficult to adjust to being treated and viewed as a quote-unquote normal human. He found that this was not the world that he knew, as others did not worship the ground that he walked on, nor did they treat him like a god. And this was exacerbated tenfold when the townsfolk, upon learning of their world noble origins, attacked the family out of hatred, burning their mansion to cinders and forcing the family to live a meager life of poverty in a ramshackle dwelling. Homing begged for assistance from the world nobles but was shot down, with Doflamingo bearing witness to the entire thing. And ultimately, Doflamingo's mother succumbed to illness due to persistent exposure to these horrific living conditions and passed away. Soon after, Doflamingo, his father, and brother were strung up and tortured. And this was the proper turning point of Doflamingo's life, the event that helped him to contextualize who he was, what he wanted to do with his life, and how he was going to enact the change on the world that he desired. Here, the heart of his life had been ripped out, and in his grief, what he realized was that without the world in its natural state, that is, without him being on top, all he would experience is grief and pain. And he needed to do anything to avoid this. He was tortured, and his mother died as a result of the world not conforming to what he believed was its natural order, and his father was at fault for doing this, for messing with truth and balance. He had seen the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, but the latter was an unnatural state not intended for him by his perception, and so from here on out, the motive was to avoid repeating this trauma. And so, while holding a deep resentment for his father for not understanding the way the world was supposed to be, to properly set the world right, Doflamingo vowed to kill everyone and reinstate his perception of a natural world state. In short, he needed control once more. And to have control over his fear, he had to wield fear. This was the root. Surprisingly, this care and the resulting agony of loss. He adored his mother, and she was taken from him due to his father breaking the status quo by leaving the world nobles. As we'll explore later, Doflamingo feels excessively. He does not want to lose people, and he doesn't want to feel physical nor emotional pain similar to what he felt here. To me, his greatest fear is feeling the powerlessness and lack of control that he felt at being subjugated and persecuted, and the resultant lack of power and agency that he views as having led to the grief that he felt upon losing his mother. In this way, he's kind of like Luffy at the end of Sabaody in declaring internally that he cannot experience this pain once more. But of course, the two diverge in so many ways after this. For Doflamingo, the world's natural state is him being a god, beyond regular humans. And if the world is in its natural state, he doesn't need to face fear and pain. So this is what he strives for, with anything he does as a means to this end. He was conditioned here. With his status gone, his mother died. So to keep the world comfortable and those he cared for safe, he had to reinstate the world in a balanced way and keep his status and superiority. Not just because it's the world as he knows it, but if that order becomes askew, tragedy occurs and he loses the ones he loves. And this is shown throughout the story in a multitude of ways, but one of my favorites is how Doflamingo is presented by Oda using visual verticality. We often see him in panels very intentionally lording over others, above, with his royal palace towering over Dressrosa as well. It's not subtle, but it is incredibly effective. He's fractured, conditioned to view the world a certain way, and when that way does not yield to him, it doesn't compute, and we see what we see from him when things go out of control. Doflamingo's entire act throughout the story is one large trauma response told through visual imagery and subtext and text, and he can be summed up in the following way. Doflamingo is above any man. He is beyond any human. He has to be. Because if he isn't, then he has to feel the pain that humans feel. Sometime after this declaration, Doflamingo amassed a gathering of followers after displaying his proficiency for Conqueror's Haki upon those who persecuted him previously. The onlookers of Treble, Virgo, Pika, and Diamante were impressed, and Treble specifically then provided him with the platform to ascend the throne by giving him a pistol and the Itto Nomi, the devil fruit, stating that he was chosen by the heavens and that he should be given the means to enact whatever action he desires on the world and those who wronged him. The symbol of the pistol is self-explanatory, but the fruit is a bit more revelatory with regards to how Doflamingo processes his trauma. The Itto Nomi is a paramecia-type devil fruit that allows the user to manipulate incredibly strong strings to dominate and oppress their enemies, and this holds specific weight for Doflamingo. As someone who has experienced immense pain and trauma at the hands of string-like objects, specifically the ropes that caused him to be lynched and tortured, he now wields those very same weapons and tools to enact that same pain upon others. This allows him to dominate the object that once dominated him, to make him feel more in power over his trauma, and specifically using it against others is an easy way to feel a progression, as if he can properly avoid the pain that it caused him by redirecting it and overpowering it, wielding it on others. But it has to be strings, not any other object or weapon, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to feel like he can dominate his past. There is a healthy way to do this, and this isn't it. Causing the same pain on others doesn't allow one to process and move past their pain. It's a form of cowardice and avoidance. And you can add this to the role that he begins to play that we see in the story, that of a puppeteer and a jester, using human emotions such as rage, sadness, and grief as stepping stones to his own ends. As someone who claims to be so above humanity, he can manipulate and abuse their simple emotions because he knows exactly how humans work. But why does he understand this? Because he experienced all of this himself. As someone who experienced all of these emotions and more, he knows intimately about them, and so that allows him to use them to use others. All this together gives him what he needs to avoid his trauma and not have to repeat it. Control. Control over his pain, over his grief, and over others and humans in general, as a god in his rightful place. With this role, all is right with the world. But he doesn't realize that his ability to do all of this has basis in an understanding that he would only be able to get if he himself was human. And his yearning and longing to be above his trauma and lord over others is the most human thing possible. To pedal back, Doflamingo then used his newfound power and authority at the ripe age of 10 to kill his father using the pistol that Treble granted him, dismissing the cries of his brother Rocinante. He did this to appease the world nobles and be re-granted his old status, but to his dismay, he was rejected by the celestial dragons due to his father's prior betrayal. By his perception, his blood was stained by Homing's betrayal, and metaphorically, his father laughed at him from beyond the grave. Here, Doflamingo learned that acts that you commit stay with you throughout generations due to one's blood. Sins, deeds, achievements, legacy through blood is all, and he had inherited a given right to be on top, but it had seemingly been stained. So he desired to overthrow this and their rejection by declaring that he would get revenge on the nobility to place himself on the top forcibly. It shows an interesting wrinkle for Doflamingo. He despises the nobility for their arrogance and condescension, but once again uses their methods in this way to lord over others. It conveys a taut environment that he imposed upon those below him while also showing his hypocrisy and constant need to overcome through wielding that which subjugates him. If given the opportunity, I don't know if Doflamingo would have used different methods to overpower others, but it's all he knows, and so it's his only option. This hypocrisy, this condescension, this superiority. His acts are evil, but they are a learned evil. After acquiring the means to later blackmail the celestial dragons into accepting him, Doflamingo was properly elected as the leader of his men, who vowed to serve him as strongly as possible, to do anything in their power no matter the disproportionate cruelty to ensure that he becomes the next pirate king. And this aspect brings me to two topics regarding him. Firstly, the interesting fact that while for many in the story becoming the Pirate King is the end goal, for Doflamingo it is actually just another stepping stone. Becoming the Pirate King is just a means to his end, and his end is an eternal struggle, because his end goal is one that never ends. He needs to be a godly noble on top of everyone else, and even if he were to climb atop the world, his immediate next battle would be ensuring that he remains there, or maybe climbing the very heavens themselves. It's actually incredibly morbid if you really think about his psychological situation. Imagine having a need to constantly ensure that the world that you know is maintained, and in order to do that, you must constantly prove yourself superior to others, otherwise your entire sense of identity and internal stability will crumble, and your pain and trauma will eat you from the inside out. This is a character premise that, when matched with a less despicable character, would be very sympathetic, and regardless, despite Doflamingo's acts of evil, I do sympathize with his suffering. This is exhausting, and it's always plagued him. in his waking hours, and literally in his nightmares. He feels that he must cage others and take their freedom to feel free himself. Wielding the manifestation of his trauma, he puppeteers and manipulates and controls others like he was controlled as the only way to avoid feeling weak. And there is no end to this. His life is a constant struggle to get there. As much as his methods are evil, the nuances of the psychological processes that lead him to do this are tragic and born from genuine catastrophe. And the second aspect relating to him being elected by his men is the topic of his connection with and feelings for his crew and his subordinates. There is tons of debate about how Doflamingo feels about his men, with opinions on either side of the spectrum, and I think all of it is highly understandable given the nuance and extremes of his character. It's often debated about whether he cares about them at all, and if he does, why use them as sacrificial tools? It seems at times like he cares, but then he goes and encourages them to self-sacrifice for his goal. It feels contradictory, and it is, for any person that isn't Doflamingo. But he is a contradiction of a person, and so contradictory actions are totally in character and consistent for him. In my opinion, Doflamingo absolutely cares for his comrades and has always cared for people. Connections are things that he deeply values, and the pain of losing his mother only exacerbated his desire to hold on to them. So he cares about his crew without a doubt, and this is shown multiple times through genuine expressions of care for them, genuine words of warmth, and him being shown to have defended their pride and identity. But what's key is that this does not mean that he does not think of them as lesser than him. This doesn't mean that he isn't above them. From Doflamingo's perspective, he is both superior to his crew, and he cares for them. This sounds like a contradiction, but as I said, contradiction is this tortured mind's natural state. He learned that he is above everyone in the world, so why would his crew be any different? But at the same time, why would that mean that he doesn't care for them? There is no problem here. He is above them, but will not allow them to be disrespected or mistreated by anyone. He values them and cares for them, but also genuinely believes himself to be above them and for his needs to be the most important. Just as you or I know that neither of us is inherently better than the other, Doflamingo's world showed him that he is inherently better than the vast majority, and so he lives with that creed. Again, it isn't arrogance, it's genuine belief. And that's the thing, because his subordinates sacrifice themselves for him and his cause, and there is always a solemn lament from Doflamingo at these losses, but it simply must be done. He loses people close to him, his trauma of loss comes up again, but he knows that he must re-experience this loss in order to keep his grander goal of being on top so that he will not feel even greater loss. He puts himself through what he fears most to avoid what he fears most on a grander scale. From here, Doflamingo began his ascent. He gained political footholds, he began his black market dealings, he gathered influence and repute and ascended just as he envisioned. He further reinforced his crew with many who had no better option, even with children such as Law and Baby 5, and despite being far from the ideal home for these lost children, he offered them a chance at a family while bolstering his ranks. After a 14-year absence, Rocinante returned and reunited with his brother, seemingly gone mute due to the trauma of his past, and altogether, Doflamingo's family, the Don Quixote Pirates, gained an influence and size and properly represented a twisted, dark, and flawed yet nonetheless genuine family. This would ultimately end in tragedy, as Doflamingo would kill Rocinante, now named Corazon, due to believing him to be a traitor because of his alliance with Law and his deceptions, and as such, believing him to be an obstacle preventing him from escaping from his trauma and blocking his ascent. Doflamingo did not take this lightly at all, and as we've established, he very much cares for those around him, especially family, so it pained him to do this. But this shows a really interesting thematic dynamic between the two brothers. They both experienced nearly the same exact upbringing. They both found themselves in the exact same situations. But while Corazon came out of it all with hope and a belief in the world, Doflamingo committed horrific acts and decided to burn it all to blaze his way to the top. Corazon truly believed that his brother was evil, and it's an understandable opinion to have given that individual difference of self is what separated their life paths. but I personally think it to be a bit more nuanced than that, and a lot depends on one's own personal definition for what constitutes true evil. What is clear, however, is that an essential message is told here through their relationship. Doflamingo avoids and escapes his trauma through using the pain inflicted on him upon others to feel in control of it and to situate himself atop. But Corazon faced his pain head-on, processed it, did not run away, and instead chose to see promise in the world and to take solace in the glimmers of light. He grew, made valuable connections, and progressed past his agony. Doflamingo never did, but instead, he continued to build upon his power after this. He became one of the 7 warlords of the sea and decided to take over the ancestral home of the Don Quixote family, Dressrosa, to plant himself at the top of the world. Or at least, his world. To this end, he manipulated the immense negative emotions of others to establish chaotic, painful, rapturous theater, wielding the fear, anger, grief, and pain of the likes of Riku, Kairos, and many more in order to set the stage for his ascent and taking of the throne, as he and his men would swoop in and present themselves as the heroes of Dressrosa, ready to save the day and take over the land. Once again in complete control of the narrative, bringing forth the order that would finally establish him as a king atop the heavens and as a result, temporarily eliminating his fears. He is a man of perspective, able to understand lowly humans and their base, easily manipulated emotions because despite his aversion to them, he is a lowly human controlled by his past and emotions no matter what he tries to do. And his current methods only reinforce this. As shown by his Marineford speech about the multifaceted nature of war and victory and history, he has the perfect perspective to properly understand those on the bottom and those on top, and how results dictate history. Yet he does nothing good with that perspective and instead uses it for selfish gain. He has the experience and capacity to empathize with both sides of the societal spectrum, yet ironically he has this sort of disposition of godhood and lofty status. He could be empathetic and compassionate, and he could change the world in a different way if he wanted to. He has the experience and perspective. He's one of the few who could, but he doesn't. He is characterized by a genuine, gleeful sadism and psychopathy, and I think the reasoning for that is multifaceted. Perhaps there is an element to him that through his trauma grants him a clarity and wisdom at the broken state of the world, so much that he finds this all to be this tragicomedy that he cannot help but laugh at. Yet I also think that he acts this way because he feels such true, visceral joy at any progress towards clawing himself back to the top, as this is all a method leading to his foremost endeavor, which he yearns for like nothing else, laughing at the futility and ease with which he conducts his plans with the fervor at which he himself was laughed at, that these people could be so weak to fall to his whims. Doflamingo is a victim to that very emotion. It is why he is who he is, but he tries so hard not to see that. And so just as he uses the power that subjugated him, strings, to dominate others to feel on top, so too does he use the knowledge of his own flaws to exploit others and as a result, feel like he is beyond flaw and laugh at their weakness as they become stepping stones to him, their rightful place. Yet despite this and how I've described him before, he has no ultimate goal, just a desire to feel safe and secure day by day with his concrete endeavors actually being the methodology. But the barrier to entry for that goal is literally not allowing himself to feel inferior or even equal to anyone, which is impossible in a world like this. It's all futile, an endless struggle to a peak of the world that he cannot even conceptualize but needs to get to, and with a path like this, there was never going to be proper peace in his heart. But he was able to hide and delude himself into thinking that he was beyond all of that as he became the king of Dressrosa and established a dynasty of sorts, a stronghold dictated by him and his family who he so fervently cared for despite thinking of them as naturally lesser. And then enter Luffy, someone who seeks his freedom not through ruling others and ignoring his pain, but through facing it head-on, learning from it, processing it, and seeing the beauty in the connections he's formed to propel and empower himself forward. In addition, Luffy is far from averse to weakness and seeing himself as inferior to others in ways. He freely admits multiple times that he is inadequate and that he is complimented and compensated for by the strengths of his crew. He knows that life is full of pain, and he sure as hell isn't immune to it, but he has learned how to strive for a bright future regardless. Luffy knows that he is just a guy, that no human is more than a human, and that modesty and lack of ego is specifically why he works as a hero for so many. Luffy is an exact inverse of Doflamingo in so many ways, with the core link between them just being a desire for freedom. But while Doflamingo needs to control everything to be free, and actually cages himself in the process, Luffy just wants to live day by day in a way that he can be proud of. People are weak, but Doflamingo, he's on top, above it all. Surely. He's not susceptible to being a victim to his emotions like humans are, because if he was, he'd be a human rather than a god. And he can't have that, can he? Because that would mean that he was susceptible to the pain that humans have. He's a paradox, coping, constantly aspiring when it seems that there's nothing to aspire to, yet still lower than others. He proclaims to be a god, yet fears and is looked down upon by the likes of Kaido. He is dangling himself by a string, unable to face his pain with honesty, and so his rule is a constant exercise in placing himself above others and offering evidence that he is beyond humanity. Because he exploits them and dominates their emotions and power, he is faultless and above. No one can challenge him because he is a god, and as such, there is no need to feel weak or feel fear. But that isn't true godhood or power. Locking away a part of oneself and building over one's weakness with coping mechanisms and oppression rather than facing it and overcoming pain is a large vulnerability. And Doflamingo avoids the truth. That isn't a god, it's someone who acts how he does because of fear. It's someone that doesn't control others, but is controlled by his demons. And it's difficult to parse that out through all his layers, but we see it in the end. Doflamingo's glasses hide his eyes, the most honest part of a person. Because despite his connections, he doesn't let anyone in. He avoids intimacy and proper truth, despite that intimacy and warmth being the cause of the agony that led him down this path in the first place. But then, in Dressrosa, Luffy brings him back down to earth. The verticality that Doflamingo wielded and used to lord over others is reversed as he and Luffy fight, and Luffy crashes him back down and towers above him. This illuminates Doflamingo's two largest fears, as it's a reminder of his trauma in the most visceral sense, a reminder that he is not a god and as a result, is vulnerable to pain and loss. And secondly, it emphasizes that he is just like everyone else. In essence, the truth. He cannot stomach this, it does not compute, and it is everything he has built his life towards trying to avoid. And yet, it still happens. His glasses break, shattering the mask of godhood and showing him for who he is, and his facade is shattered by the boy who experienced similar loss, but who dealt with it with honesty and became stronger rather than avoiding his pain and the possibility of future pain. Doflamingo only ever caged himself with his inability to grow, but Luffy grew and provided himself with the platform to be free. He made strides to become strong enough to not be overpowered in the same way, rather than trying to avoid the possibility of pain altogether through submitting to his fear. Whereas Doflamingo did things to make him feel on top without addressing the core issue. In these two foils, we see two completely different ways of dealing with trauma. One that is healthy with basis in reality, that builds oneself up so that they be strong enough to face reality and move on. And one whose success is totally dependent on a strong yet unbending coping mechanism that was bound to break one day, not ever being broken. At this point in the story, I definitely wouldn't go as far as to say that Luffy frees Doflamingo through breaking his cage and shattering his complexes, but what he does do is provide him with the foundation to properly grow and become genuinely strong, to actually move on from his pain and hold his lost loved ones close to his heart while not constantly living life afraid of subjugation and loss. Luffy forces Doflamingo to face what he had been avoiding, and it obviously causes him to experience rage and fear that he had not felt in decades, but that sort of pain can be the platform for progression, as Luffy knows better than anyone else. Now the question to me with Doflamingo is it possible for him to break out of this and properly begin viewing the world differently? I'm not saying that he will immediately somehow become a protagonist or that he'll stop being the shit disturber that he is, and I don't think he will, and I don't necessarily want him to. But will he begin viewing the world in a more sustainable, realistic way? Will he accept that he isn't a god? That not only did he take freedom from others, but that his lack of honesty with himself actually built his own cage from which he was unable to face truth honestly? As for me, I genuinely have no idea what he'll do. Perhaps the grief of his mother's death and his subsequent torture broke him beyond repair, and his taunts and laughs after his defeat at Dressrosa represent his response to the absurdity of the world for constantly defying him and reinforcing what he cannot accept is true. Perhaps he has resorted to simply being a jester, commenting and observing from the sidelines and reveling in it all. Or perhaps those maniacal cackles at the oncoming war are born from a breakthrough and a realization that he must properly confront the absurdity of the world and grasp true freedom with his own two hands. Will his parallels with Emu show us two lost souls unable to move on from their pain and depressing everything to avoid it as they bury and flood a world that terrifies them with their compensation? Or will he show a contrast with Emu through his growth, as the heavenly demon who emerged from the very pits of hell to carve a path for himself? Will he finally admit and see the beauty of what it means to be human? Either way, Doflamingo's role in this story is far from done. And while on one hand that means that his role in the story isn't complete, there is still a comprehensive, four-dimensional, masterful character study here already chronicling the journey of someone who wants what all of our protagonists want, and in the face of his pain just made the wrong decision at every turn. Layering coping mechanism on top of coping mechanism until he trapped himself, with no one capable of springing that cage except a certain heaven-sent boy. Doflamingo is a sublime character, complex and layered yet so organic, mechanically and technically brilliant and yet so emotionally hard-hitting, capable of so much evil and yet incredibly morally complex in so many ways. He is a paradox frozen by tragedy, and only time will tell if he is able to become more than that. Many thanks for watching.